Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Jason's path to Britt began with a fleeting but unmistakable moment in Europe, a moment that shattered years of certainty about her fate. While passing through the bustling terminal of Paris's Charles de Gaulle Airport, his attention caught on a familiar silhouette in the crowd. It wasn't the kind of idle recognition one sometimes feels toward a stranger, it was precise, sharp, and deeply ingrained. The tilt of her head, the stride that balanced grace and urgency, even the faint glint of hair catching the fluorescent light, all of it screamed Britt Westbourne. For anyone else, it could have been an eerie coincidence, but for Jason, it was a call to action. He knew without question that this was no ghost, no figment of grief or imagination. Britt was alive. From that instant, his life narrowed into a singular focus. He began a solitary pursuit, driven by a blend of instinct and relentless discipline. The trail was faint and deliberately obscured, buried beneath layers of false leads and erased records. Every fragment of information had to be pried from reluctant sources or gleaned from whispers in places where powerful men conducted business in hushed tones. Slowly, he pieced together a path, one that wound through Europe's shadow markets, private docks, and encrypted communications. Until every thread converged on one destination, the Five Poppies Resort. The Five Poppies was, on the surface, a gleaming jewel of luxury, a retreat for the global elite. But beneath its manicured gardens and grand facades lurked a world few outsiders could imagine. Hidden corridors threaded through the resort's foundations, linking secure rooms where high-stakes deals were struck and experiments of questionable morality were carried out. Behind the glamour lay the operations of Professor Henry Hank Dalton, a man whose public persona as a visionary scientist concealed his role as the architect of a covert biotechnology project so sensitive that the World Security Bureau, WSB, had been monitoring him for months. Inside this fortress of wealth and secrecy, Jocelyn Jacks and Agent Vaughn had been working undercover, posing as newlyweds to get close to Dalton and gather evidence of his activities. Their progress had been steady but cautious, until the moment Joss caught sight of Britt. The shock of that encounter unsettled her. She had no clear picture of whether Britt was a willing partner in Dalton's plans or a prisoner trapped in the web. If the former were true, every scrap of intelligence they had painstakingly gathered could be compromised. If the latter, the danger was even greater, because it meant Dalton was capable of controlling people the Bureau believed were dead. And perhaps he wasn't acting alone. The specter of Caesar Faison, long presumed dead yet whispered about in the intelligence community, loomed over her thoughts. While Joss was still reeling from that sighting, Jason had already breached the resort's perimeter. His infiltration was deliberate, relying on the same calculated patience that had carried him through countless missions. It was during a quiet sweep of the service corridors that he heard it. A voice carried faintly through the hum of ventilation fans and the distant clink of glassware from the main hall. He knew it instantly. Britt, speaking in low, urgent tones to Pascal, Dalton's gatekeeper and enforcer. Jason tracked the sound through a maze of narrow hallways until it led him to a small, dimly lit room tucked behind a hidden section of wall. When their eyes met, time seemed to collapse. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Britt's face was a storm of disbelief and emotion. Shock at seeing him alive, fear for what his presence here meant, and a surge of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Her chest tightened as though the air had been pulled from the room. She had buried the thought of Jason long ago, telling herself it was the only way to survive, and now he stood before her, impossibly real. She also understood in an instant the deadly implications. Jason's being here, inside the Five Poppies, meant he was walking a razor's edge. This was a place where every movement was monitored, where walls concealed cameras, and where trust was an expendable currency. Any mistake would not just expose him, it would end him. With only moments before a guard's patrol loop brought them into the corridor, Britt made a choice. In a voice barely above a whisper, she gave him what she had risked everything to learn. She told him of Dalton's research, an illicit biotechnology program that went far beyond the ethical boundaries of science. On the surface, it masqueraded as a cutting-edge effort to cure Huntington's disease. In truth, it was a front for something far more sinister, the genetic modification and neurological conditioning of human subjects for control and manipulation. Then she told him how she had survived her supposed death. Dalton had offered her a deal, cooperate in his research in exchange for access to a drug that could hold her illness at bay. It was not a choice born of loyalty, but of necessity. Survival meant existing under constant watch, every action logged, every movement restricted. The luxury of the 5 Poppies was a gilded cage, and she was both its prize specimen and its prisoner. In those brief seconds, Jason absorbed more than just her words. He understood the weight she carried, the lines she had been forced to cross, and the peril they now both faced. This was no simple rescue. What she had given him was not only the key to unraveling Dalton's operation, but the confirmation that she herself was the linchpin in a game far more dangerous than he had imagined. Jason felt the air in the narrow passage grow heavier as Britt's voice lingered on the name, Faison. It was as if the sound itself carried a residue of dread, an echo of battles fought long ago and the scars they had left behind. For Jason, Faison wasn't just another adversary. He was a relentless phantom, a predator who had haunted his world and left ruin in his wake. If Britt's suspicion was correct, if the man truly stood behind Dalton's operation, then the 5 Poppies was no longer a fortress to infiltrate, it was a killing ground designed to draw in and dismantle its enemies. The thought sharpened Jason's instincts into something primal. The risk had multiplied, the mission had shifted, and the clock had started to burn through whatever time they thought they had. In that dim, cold room tucked away from the gilded halls above, Jason's eyes locked with Britt's, reading more than her words. She wasn't simply here because she'd been unlucky enough to fall into Dalton's orbit. She was central to the entire mechanism. Every file, every experiment, every prototype that moved through this place had, at some stage, passed under her reluctant gaze. She was the choke point, the witness, the potential whistleblower, and in a place like this, that made her the single most valuable and most dangerous person alive. But the luxury of analysis was gone. Across the resort, in the outwardly serene wing where the undercover agents kept their suite, chaos had erupted. Under orders from Colette Moreau, Pascal had unleashed one of the resort's silent hounds, a man trained not for showy intimidation but for swift, quiet erasure. The assassin moved with surgical precision, breaching Vaughn's quarters while the cover of routine housekeeping masked his entry. Within seconds, a garrote was looped around Vaughn's throat, his muscles seizing as oxygen vanished. Vaughn's fingers clawed at the cord, his eyes already dimming. Jocelyn heard it. First as a muted thump, then as the unmistakable scrape of a chair against the floor. She was through the door before thought could catch up, her sidearm rising in a fluid motion drilled into her by hours of training and instinct honed in the field. One pull of the trigger, one muffled crack, and the attacker dropped. The cord slid from Vaughn's neck as he crumpled to his knees, gasping in jagged bursts. There was no time for relief. The shot had been clean, but it had also been loud enough to ripple through the resort's security system in ways they wouldn't yet see. She had saved his life, but in doing so had broken the cardinal rule of undercover work in a place like this: don't let them see you bleed, don't let them see you fight. Now she was marked. Whoever gave the order would know she was dangerous, that she had acted with lethal intent inside their walls. In 5 Poppies, that meant only one outcome: escalation. The escalation came faster than she expected. Within the hour, word found its way to Joss. Jason Morgan was inside. For her, that changed the calculus entirely. Jason was a variable she hadn't planned for, a disruption she couldn't ignore. The mission had been delicate enough before, now it teetered on the edge of collapse. Every move he made could unravel months of slow infiltration. The dilemma was immediate and brutal. Honor her orders from WSB, which might mean letting Britt's fate seal itself, or join Jason in tearing the place open from the inside, gambling the mission, their covers, and possibly their lives. Back in the hidden room, Britt felt the weight of the same decision, though from the opposite angle. If Jason turned back now, if he could vanish before anyone realized he was here, he might yet escape unscathed. But the thought of letting him walk away gnawed at her. The years had been long, suffocating, her every breath measured by the drug Dalton allowed her, her every action shadowed by guards and cameras. She had played the part, survived in the only way she could, but deep inside, she had been waiting for a crack in the armor. Jason's arrival was that crack. It might never come again. The plan took shape like a knife being sharpened. Britt had been collecting more than information in her time here, she had been watching. Every guard shift was etched into her mind, every blind angle of every camera committed to memory. She knew the patrol patterns like the rhythm of her own pulse, knew the exact seconds when a hallway would be empty, the precise moments when the surveillance feed flickered into static during system recalibrations. She knew which doors were decorative and which led to the real heart of the compound. The escape route she envisioned was buried deep beneath the resort's pristine floors. A service tunnel that led to the most restricted sector of the underground laboratories, terminating in a concealed exit behind the medical supply depot. Above ground, it looked like any other storage space. Below, it connected to an egress route that emerged well beyond the outer perimeter. The problem was the lock, a layered security system requiring both a coded keycard and biometric authentication. Only Pascal and Dalton possessed full clearance. Britt explained this to Jason with a precision born from months of silent planning. To get out, they would need to either take Pascal's access directly or copy it in seconds, a feat that would require a perfect distraction elsewhere in the compound. She outlined the blind spots, the timing, the likely choke points. She even knew the quickest way to neutralize the two guards who rotated through the depot without triggering the alarm sequence. Jason listened, his mind already running through contingencies, weighing risks against outcomes. There would be no margin for error. The 5 Poppies was not the kind of place where failure meant capture, it was the kind of place where failure meant disappearance. If they moved, they would have one chance, and one chance only, to break the cage and take down the monsters who built it. ChatGPT de NOI. Jason had seen plenty of operations collapse in the space between one heartbeat and the next, but nothing compared to the slow, deliberate way the air seemed to thicken in that tunnel when the figure stepped into view. For an instant it was just a silhouette framed in the dim red wash of the emergency lighting, shoulders squared, head tilted with the easy confidence of someone who knew he had already won. Then the details began to emerge. The sharp lines of a tailored jacket, the glint of polished shoes that didn't belong in the grime of an underground passage, the faint curl of steam from a cigarette between 2 fingers. And finally, the voice. Smooth, deliberate, and cold enough to slice through the humid stillness. Jason felt it before he truly heard it, the recognition detonating in his chest like a silent blast. It was a voice he had carried like a scar, Caesar Faison. The sound froze Britt in place. Her breath hitched, and her eyes widened in the way of someone confronted not just with a threat, but with a ghost. She had whispered his name to Jason only hours earlier, but some part of her had still hoped she was wrong, that her suspicion was just the echo of paranoia born from captivity. Now, there was no room left for doubt. He was here, in the flesh, blocking the only path to freedom. The plan that had felt so precise, so razor-sharp in its execution, suddenly felt like a child's drawing compared to the game they were actually playing. The tunnel's narrowness turned the moment into a standoff. Behind Jason and Britt, the faint whir of distant machinery echoed, each hum reminding them that the camera loop from Britt's device would only hold for so long. Any second now, the scrambling signal would reset, the feeds would catch up, and an alarm would sound. Ahead, Faison's presence was its own clock, ticking down to something far worse than discovery. Above them, the gala continued, the music and laughter bleeding faintly through layers of concrete. Vaughn and Joss were still in motion, holding the distraction together, unaware that their carefully staged chaos had given Jason and Britt just enough rope to hang themselves with. They could not have known that the man they were trying to outmaneuver had already moved his most dangerous piece into play. Jason's mind worked in overdrive, mapping out the angles. There was no way past without going through Faison, and no version of that ended cleanly. Retreating meant threading back through corridors that could already be crawling with guards. Fighting here meant noise, and noise meant a cascade of armed response that neither he nor Britt could outrun. Yet standing still meant handing control over to the one man who had built a career on turning other people's hesitation into his victory. Britt's thoughts were a different storm. She knew Faison's methods intimately, his love for psychological pressure, his appetite for forcing choices that broke people from the inside out. In her captivity, Dalton had been the one she saw every day, the one who gave orders and enforced them. But Dalton had always been a lieutenant in spirit, no matter his title. Faison was the architect. If he was here, it meant he had been watching her all along, perhaps even shaping the conditions of her survival to lead her to this exact moment. She felt the weight of the stolen credentials in Jason's possession, the key that could open the way out, and the cruel irony that the man who had unknowingly just given them that key was a loyal weapon in Faison's arsenal. Even if they made it past, Faison's presence here meant every hallway and exit beyond could already be compromised. Jason adjusted his stance, subtly shifting to place himself half a step in front of Britt. His every sense was primed, reading for the smallest opening, but the tension in the air told him Faison wasn't here to attack outright. No, he was here to trap them without firing a shot, to fold them into a position where escape became mathematically impossible. That was his style. He didn't just want them caught, he wanted them to understand they had been outplayed. Somewhere deep in the compound, an automated chime signaled the end of a security cycle. It was faint, but Jason heard it, and so did Faison. He saw it in the man's eyes, the slight upward curve of his mouth. The loop on the cameras was seconds from collapsing. If they didn't move now, the feed would refresh, see them in a restricted zone, and every exit would seal. Britt's mind raced. She thought of Joss upstairs, still playing her part without knowing the ground was falling away beneath her. She thought of Vaughn, barely surviving the assassin's garrote, and how much blood had already been spent just to reach this point. Most of all, she thought of the years she had lost, the things she had done to survive, and how Faison had always been the phantom she could never outrun. This was her moment to choose. Try to slip past him and risk everything, or give up the only shot she and Jason might ever have to destroy him and Dalton together. Jason's jaw tightened. He could feel Britt's hesitation, her breath quickening behind him, but he kept his voice low, controlled, and calm enough to cut through her panic. He didn't look at her, he couldn't afford to, but his presence at her side was deliberate, a silent assurance that they were still in this together, even if the tunnel was collapsing around them. Faison took a step forward, the light catching just enough of his face to make the smirk visible. The sound of it, the quiet scrape of his shoe against the concrete, seemed to fill the entire tunnel. And with that, Jason knew the game had shifted again. They were no longer trying to escape the 5 Poppies. They were standing at the threshold of a confrontation years in the making, one that could decide not only whether they walked out alive, but whether the criminal empire coiled inside this resort would survive the night. Faison's shadow stretched toward them in the tunnel, swallowing the weak emergency light as he advanced with the unhurried gait of a predator who already had his prey cornered. Jason's stance lowered slightly, his center of gravity shifting. Not to lunge recklessly, but to prepare for whatever move might come next. He didn't underestimate Faison. No one who'd ever gone against the man and survived made that mistake twice. The older man thrived on pressure, on turning the narrowest of spaces into his personal arena, on making his opponent feel the weight of inevitability. Jason's mind was already calculating. In a confined space like this, speed could be decisive, but so could timing. Faison wasn't armed in any obvious way. Not that it mattered. Men like him carried their weapons in layers, hidden blades, concealed firearms, syringes with toxins, or simply the advantage of knowing exactly where every guard in the building was stationed. Engaging him physically could unleash a wave of reinforcements within seconds. But letting him keep speaking, letting him get into their heads, could be just as dangerous. Behind Jason, Britt felt her pulse thudding in her ears, every muscle in her body tensed between fight and flight. The years had changed her, hardened her, but they hadn't dulled her understanding of the man in front of them. Faison had a way of making the air itself feel toxic, as if the oxygen carried his intent. She recognized the faint glint in his eyes. The same look he'd worn when manipulating others into doing his work for him, when he'd stood behind Dalton and whispered strategies that left people broken. Now, he was here, not as a distant architect but as the final barrier between them and freedom. He spoke again, the words rolling out slow, deliberate, each syllable heavy with condescension. He didn't need to shout, his voice carried easily in the tight corridor, coiling around them, pressing into the edges of their resolve. Jason didn't respond, not verbally. His silence was a tactic, a refusal to give Faison more to work with, but his eyes tracked every movement, waiting for a slip, a tell, anything that might turn this standoff in their favor.